Welcome to another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. With me, as always, is Don Cooney, who is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western, and Don is also a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. And our special guest for this edition, welcoming back to the program, is Paul Clements. Paul is a professor in political science at Western Michigan University, and he also happens to be a candidate for Congress from the Michigan 6th Congressional District. And I guess you're officially a candidate now since the primaries are passed, and you have been officially nominated now, right? So you're the official Democratic Party candidate in the Michigan 6th Congressional District. So welcome back, Paul. We've had you on the program a number of different times, so it's always great to see you and great to have you here.
Thanks, Ron.
Let's start off by talking about, I know one of the issues that motivated you to run in the first place is the issue of climate change. And we have a pretty important summit coming up in New York City at the United Nations in September. Secretary Ban Ki-moon has called for the world leaders to come to New York to attend this summit. President Obama is going to be there. The Chinese premier is going to be there. So from your perspective, what's the importance of this particular summit, and what's the long-range role that we need to be working on at the international level?
Sure. You know, Ron, as you and the three of us have discussed before, climate change is very clearly the most serious environmental challenge that we in Michigan and the country and the world faces in this century. And if we're going to have an effective way to rein in greenhouse gases, to keep the warming to 2 degrees or less, which is what the scientific and political communities have said we absolutely have to do. But the only really effective way to get that is with an international agreement. If we don't have the United States and China and India and the other countries on board with fixed, clear, legal limits of how much carbon pollution they're going to be able to emit, then we're not really going to be effectively able to keep it to that 2 degrees limit. Now, the international community has been working on this for a long time, and frankly, getting virtually nowhere. Kyoto didn't have much effect on this. The discussions, they've kind of figured out that we're probably not going to be able to get an agreement this year, but Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, he understands that this is the biggest issue of the century for him. And so he's making a big priority. He wants to get all the political leaders together to make whatever commitments they can to prepare the way for next year's Conference of Parties discussion, where we can hope that we can move towards some kind of legal limits at that point, a year from now.
There is going to be another Conference of Parties this December in Lima, Peru. But it seems pretty clear that we're not ready yet. The pieces aren't in place to come up with that legally binding agreement.
That's right.
And so the 2015 Conference of Parties, which will be held in Paris, has been sort of designated as the spot where we really have to, we've got to get this done at that particular point.
That's right.
So what kind of things do you think would have to go on in New York next month in order to help us get to where we need to be in Paris in 2015?
You know, the two critical players here are the United States and China. And it's great that President Obama and also Xi Jinping, the premier in China, they're both going to be there. Both the United States and China have been making significant moves in reducing carbon pollution, although China has so much dependent upon coal, which is very dirty fuel, that they have a bigger challenge to overcome to get down to where they need to be. But they've been doing some important things. President Obama, with the recent initiatives, reducing coal power plant emissions, that's pretty significant. So both of those countries have been taking some steps, but they're nowhere near enough. They don't take us nearly far enough to where you would be if you were moving towards a binding commitment that gets us down to that 2 degrees Celsius target. So having the two of them in the room where they can work together, hopefully talk together about, this is for the American people, for the Chinese people, for the people of Michigan, for the people of the world, they need to work something out here. They need to come to grips with this. They need to take the leadership for binding agreements to cut emissions to the level that will allow us to stop at 2 degrees Celsius. And that's what Ban Ki-moon is hoping that we'll see in 2015. He knows it's not going to happen this year, so don't push it if it's not going to happen. If the momentum can be building between now and 2015, there's a chance. There's a real chance we could see that in 2015. If we get China and the United States on board, Europe is already pretty much here. Then there's a very good chance that the other countries of the world would also step forward, and we could be moving where we need to go.
So you're optimistic that things are starting to move a little bit, Paul? What do you think?
Well, it's hard to know how optimistic we should be about these international agreements. We've been disappointed, so many times before. But certainly the science has been clear for a long time, and the new scientific evidence usually tells us that actually things are worse than we thought. So the more science we have coming out, we've just learned this last year that with the warming of the Antarctic, that we're pretty much committed in the long term to seeing 7 or 8 meters of sea level rise. Just 2 years ago, we didn't know that, but now we know it in the long, maybe over, 500 years, 800 years, 7 or 8 meters of sea level rise. We probably can't stop that at this point. We're seeing California facing the worst drought in recorded history, and we don't know how much worse that's going to get. So the new science makes it clear that things are even worse than we thought. The public opinion is moving gradually, but there's some positive signs there. It's a big deal to make these binding commitments. It's a big change, and we know it's a big real challenge. But no, I would like to feel optimistic.
Yeah, it's so hard because you're talking such long-term things, and people are saying, well, I can't think about that. I got to get there, and I don't see it happening. But the reality is the dangers are so great. How do you get ordinary people to get concerned about this? I know this is what people have been trying to do for a long time. I don't think Obama can move unless the people in the country say, hey, we really need to do this.
Well, part of the thing is that it's not just something for the future. That last year was the hottest year on record in American history. There have been many parts of the United States, the majority of the United States, just in the last couple of years, have seen the worst droughts they've ever seen. I've already mentioned the California situation. Just last month, the month of June, was a lovely month here in Kalamazoo, but it was the hottest June in recorded history around the world. Hurricane Sandy, we've seen worse hurricanes. We're seeing more tornadoes. All these things are just what climate change predicts. So climate change is with us today. People are seeing those results today. That being said, this is a long-term thing. And it's true that the scarier, more harmful results of the carbon we're emitting today and the trajectory we're on, they do come in the future. It does get a lot worse, some years down the line. And so I think that in terms of raising that public awareness, we need to ask, the young people, the people in universities, people in the press, we're all, if we're going to be reasonable, responsible adults about this, we have a responsibility to our children, to our children's children, to take care of this. We cannot burden them with climate chaos, and it's going to take people stepping up to that to get the kind of public support that we need, that President Obama needs to take the leadership that he ought to take.
James Hansen, who's probably the top climate ecologist in the United States, wrote a popular book about climate change, and the title of it is Storms of My Grandchildren, which I think is a very apt title. Now that I'm a grandfather, I certainly appreciate and understand that level of concern. And I do think that has to be the focus. What kind of a world are we leaving for our grandchildren and their children? Even if the worst effects are well off into the future. We know bad things are happening now, but even if the worst effects are off into the future, I think we have an obligation, ethical, moral obligation, to think about what kind of a world we're leaving for for future generations. What is it? Some of the Native people say you must think 7 generations into the future, and we're certainly not doing that with regards to our current usage of fossil fuels and carbon emissions that we're creating that lead to global warming and climate change.
Sure. Yeah.
Could I say one other thing on that? The adjustments that are going to have to be made. For example, this summer I was in West Virginia, and so much of their economy is centered around coal, and so much of their jobs around coal. And that's the worst pollutant, I guess.
Right.
So the transition that those people are going to have to make to a different kind of an economy, I think is tremendously challenging and hard for people to think long term when they see what's got to happen right now.
You know, it's interesting. There are certainly specific communities, like the ones you mentioned, that will face very, very serious challenge. And I think that the country has an obligation to help them through that.
Yeah.
But it's not really economically all that terribly difficult. Actually, the economic studies show that the cost to U.S. GNP we have the technology to transition to a clean energy economy would be a decimal point, would be just a calculation error point. That is not that expensive. The part of the challenge is that it would be, for the most part, large oil companies and some coal companies that would be losing out, and they've been prepared to spend a lot of money to push public opinion, to confuse the issue, to give actually false science some of the time. I mean, for the country, economically, it's not a big deal. And so certainly, since we can do it, we need to do it. Not that expensive to do it. It's actually going to be healthier because you know that petroleum and coal, it's not just the carbon emissions, but they also have other kinds of pollution that cause asthma, that cause so many other respiratory diseases. So it's going to help in terms of health in many respects. And so it's not too expensive. It has a lot of positive things. We need to do it for ourselves, for our grandchildren. Let's get moving.
There was a recent report that came out from Greenpeace and some other organizations that were calculating that renewable is a very doable kind of thing. We could have almost 100% renewable energy in this country by 2050. And so it's not like it's some far off thing. I think a lot of people argue that it's going to be too difficult, too expensive, too disruptive, but that's really just part of the scaremongering that's going on here, isn't it? That the economic costs are too high and the technology's not there. That's just, again, part of the broader scaremongering, I think, isn't it?
It really is scaremongering, and I'm sad to say that if we look at the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, and our congressmen in particular, they've really been moved by this scaremongering. Our congressman, my opponent, in the upcoming in November election, he is he's chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the most powerful committee in the House of Representatives on climate policy, and he used to say that we should be taking action on climate change. He used to understand this. He used to get it. But after he got that chairmanship, maybe the price of the chairmanship, it's hard to know, was to go along with his party's line, and his party's line has been not to believe the science. Now he says he doesn't believe what almost all scientists do understand, that it's caused by humans. He's getting a lot of contributions from the energy, petroleum, coal companies we've already been talking about. It's hard to know just exactly where that motivation comes from, but he's gone from saying that we need to reduce greenhouse gases to doing everything he can to block federal action on addressing climate change. So he's become a real enemy. Well, according to the LA Times, Congress's #1 enemy of the earth. Now, you look at that political development, not just Congressman Upton, but his whole party, and the disinformation that has contributed to that, but the consequences of that for all of us. And I mean, you know that's part of why I'm running this race, that's one of the issues that I really care about. But let's now jump forward to the issue of jobs that you brought up, because that's also something that Congressman Upton talks about a lot. And, I'm a professor at Western, I teach national economic development strategies. It's very clear that the countries that have had rapid industrial economic growth have done so by looking forward at the market, by looking at seeing where's there going to be increasing demand in the future. Well, because of climate change, we know that we're going to have to be reducing coal-based, petroleum-based energy. We know that we're going to have to be increasing windmills, solar, the other clean energy thing. There's going to be increasing demand, not only in the United States, but around the world for the specific technologies, the specific manufactured products that allow all the countries to move towards clean energy. Well, Congressman Upton and his party have continued to subsidize petroleum, oil, dirty coal to a considerable amount and have done virtually nothing, very little for the clean energy, which is where the jobs are for the future. That's where you're going to be seeing increasing manufacturing, increasing exports, increasing demand in the future. So if we want to be rebuilding manufacturing here in Michigan, which we need to do, then Upton's actually hurting us very, very significantly by blocking that change.
What about rebuild manufacturing? What do you mean by that, Paul? What are some of the ideas that you have when rebuilding the manufacturing in Michigan?
Sure. Well, we all know that Michigan historically has been a major manufacturing state, that with the historic decline, the auto industry is coming back now, but it's coming back from having gone down for quite some time. That our manufacturing has diminished considerably here in Michigan, and that's been the major cause behind the increase in unemployment that we've seen, an increase in poverty coming from that here in Michigan. Well, again, I'll say that, I teach national economic development strategies. I've been teaching that for 18 years, and it's very clear that there are a range of strategies. There's no silver bullet. There's a range of strategies that a government can use to rebuild manufacturing, and Congressman Upton and his party have, for the most part, been against all of them. All right? One of them is looking forward in areas like clean energy, but also other high-tech areas, and looking to see where can we anticipate rationally that you can expect increasing demand for manufacturing products in maybe the 15, 20-year period. And then how do you push forward on the science and technology and the links between the lab floor and the shop floor, so you can be incorporating the leading science, the leading technology in the specific areas where you can expect to have increasing demand, and then build that here at home. Well, Upton's been voting against many of the aspects of this. It's also across the board in education. If you want to have good-paying manufacturing jobs, you need to have a well-educated labor force. And we all know that we've been seeing the state government cutting its investment in public universities, which we've all experienced as professors at Western. But it's broader than that. I mean, we know now, the evidence is very clear, that good quality preschool is extraordinarily cost-effective at setting a foundation for success in education and success in life. And yet, here in Michigan and across the country, a lot of kids don't yet have access to good quality preschool. That should be a no-brainer. It's going to take work, because to have good quality preschool, you have to have enough good preschool teachers. So it's going to have a substantial increase of demand for good preschool teachers. But we should be doing that today. We should be training them at Western today, and we're not doing that. In K-12 education, we need to be strengthening that. I mean, colleges, it's not just the decline in funding from the state. It's also that expenses have been rising, that Fred Upton has voted to cut Pell Grants. He's voted to cut federal government support for higher education. We're seeing so many kids now graduate from college with such an enormous student debt. And a lot of times they're paying 6, 7, 8, 9% interest on these federal loans, or sometimes private loans that might have some kind of federal guarantee or connection. Well, remember those banks that crashed our economy back in 2008, that helped to crash the economy? There are other people, but they helped. Well, we've been giving the government, the Federal Reserve, has been giving them loans at 0.25%, less than 0.25% interest, while our students who are investing in their own education that's going to support our economy, support our democracy in the future, they're paying 6, 7, 8, 9%. That doesn't make any sense. Upton's been voting to support these things. He's been voting to cut funding for student loans. We need to make more money available for that, and we need to get the interest rates down to the lowest level that it takes just to cover the basic costs for that, which would probably be somewhere in the area of 3%. And that would dramatically reduce the debt burden on students coming out of college. And therefore, you step back a step, then that will then strengthen, that'll encourage more students to go further in higher education, strengthen our economy, help us to have the kind of workforce that we need to rebuild manufacturing.
Good point. The notion that government is always the problem and not simply a part of the solution, which is sort of the mantra of the Republican Party, is a very decided ideological obstacle there. I mean, you just outlined important ways that government, through making sound public investment, can benefit our economy and create jobs and educate our children and create positive outcomes for all Americans. And yet the notion that we hear from the Republican side is that government can't do anything right, and therefore, but at the same time, they're giving large subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. They're supporting the banks, as you point out, with these low interest. So they're actually involving government in certain kinds of activities that benefit large corporations, but denying the kind of sound public investments that are going to help the broad range of Americans.
Yeah, I mean, no one today would say, oh gosh, we shouldn't have Social Security. No one should say, oh gosh, we shouldn't have public education. Obviously, these are government. But we look at the Republican Party in Congress and the kind of rhetoric and the kind of actual budgets that they're proposing, and the idea that government is consistently the problem is actually, that kind of is pretty close to what they seem to be saying. And a lot of times they just say it straight out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, something as basic as our roads and infrastructure. Well, we all know that we've got to be investing in the roads, we've got to be fixing the bridges, that if we want to be rebuilding the economy, that it wastes money not to fix these things. But not just here in Michigan, but the federal government as well. Fred Upton has voted for a budget that would cut infrastructure funding, cut road funding, just when we need to be increasing it.
On the education thing, I just finished a book called The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got There. And they're talking about how the United States has fallen from where we were compared to the rest of the world educationally, and the consequences of that. And in Michigan, as I told you before, that we started here, the Annie Casey Foundation puts Michigan 37th in the country in educational achievement of their children. We're slipping. So it would seem like, because we're going to need educated people to succeed as a nation, that we would be putting a lot more attention on that. Instead, they're cutting all along.
Right, we certainly need to be putting more attention into education. But there's another piece of that puzzle that I think that you can appreciate. Our teachers, even though our educational standards the statistics don't look so good, our teachers are doing a pretty good job.
Yeah.
And that is to say that in the United States, even though our test scores are not as good as some other industrialized countries, which is important because we're competing with them economically, we actually have more kids in poverty than those other countries.
Right.
And once you correct for poverty, our test scores are as good or better than most of the countries in the world, most of the industrialized countries, most of our competitors. And so part of the challenge here in Michigan is we're also seeing more child poverty.
Oh, yeah.
And child poverty consistently undermines the possibility of success in education. So, we can't forget either side of this equation. We've got to work on improving education, because if you don't work now, then that generation gets lost.
Right.
But we've also got to be working on addressing child poverty, because that is the underlying concern that has been holding us back.
In fact, almost all the studies show that the chief determinant of educational success of the children is the socioeconomic condition of their parents.
Exactly.
So as we lose further behind poverty, which brings us to the whole issue of what we could do about poverty and inequality in the country.
So, Representative Paul Ryan from Wisconsin has been talking about poverty and has put forward a budget and some ideas for dealing with poverty from the Republican side. So, can you offer us a little bit of critique of the Ryan budget and the Republican plan to so-called deal with poverty?
Sure. I mean, this was a budget that was put forward by the House of Representatives, the Republican majority, this last April. It's called the Ryan budget, from its author. Congressman Upton voted for it. And in terms of all the issues we've been talking about, the Ryan budget would substantially cut education. It would cut the Pell Grants. It would also cut Medicaid. It would turn Medicare into a voucher program. It would cut a whole range of the poverty programs, but not just cut them. It would cut the budget amounts, and it would give those resources as block grants often to the state governments. Now, part of the challenge here, part of the issue here, is that historically, a lot of the state governments haven't been very effective at using block grants to actually address serious poverty issues. Also, you know that I helped to start our evaluation doctoral program at Western. You know that with many of these programs, there are best practices that have been worked out through proper scientific evaluation. So we know what works in many, not in every area, but in many areas we know what works in addressing poverty. Well, if we know what works, why not do it? Why leave 50 different state governments with whatever political winds might be blowing one way or another to figure out their own plans if you know what's going to work? So they want to cut the money. They want to leave it with the no strings attached to state governments, which sometimes will do a good job, but sometimes will do a bad job.
Right.
We know that. They want to cut a whole range of other things that also would undermine the condition of people in poverty. By the way, they also want to cut taxes for millionaires, but raise taxes for the middle class. If we look at the long-term economic situation of our country, let's say the last 30 years, what we've been seeing is the overwhelming majority of the benefits of the economic growth that we've had in the last 30 years have gone to the top 1%, top 5%, where the middle class has been either stuck or, as we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years, actually falling, actually collapsing. Well, the Ryan budget just exacerbates that. The Ryan budget is going to see the top 1% getting even more, and the middle class continuing to fall. And if it hasn't worked yet,
right,
then why start now?
Yeah, right. What do you think are some of the programs that we know would be effective? 50th anniversary of the Declaration of War on Poverty, which cut poverty in half. There were a lot of mistakes made, a lot of bureaucracy in there, but still, we know a lot of that worked, and a lot of changes were made that really benefited poor people. What would you like to see happen in that area?
We've already talked about good quality preschool. We know that works. We know it's extraordinarily cost effective. The most significant anti-poverty program of the federal government today is probably the Earned Income Tax Credit. My sister has actually been in poverty for most of her life, and she's a beneficiary of the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's helped her income. She has 6 kids. The father has not been around since the 6th one was born, so she's been responsible for them. And the Earned Income Tax Credit helped her to get she and her 6 kids up close to the poverty level, as it has with many poor people around the country. I believe that is another thing. I'd have to check the details on this. I think the Ryan budget also reduces funding in that area. But certainly that's another one of the very strong programs.
Right. Very much so. It's a real transfer of income to people.
It's a transfer of income, but also based upon work.
Yeah.
Right. Because
you don't get it unless you work.
You don't get it unless you work, and I think people are healthier. They're going to be better off if they can do the work, whatever work they can do.
Yeah. Good point.
the Congress has not been very active this year in terms of passing legislation. Part of it is, of course, we have divided government, right? The Senate is in Democratic hands and the House is in Republican hands at this point. And any kind of initiative that the Obama administration has wanted to put forward has been blocked pretty much by the Republican Party, which I think many nonpartisan or objective political scientists would say has become the most extremely partisan party in American history. So the Obama administration has, whenever it can, been trying to use executive orders to accomplish the important goals of the American people and move business forward. But now, Congressman Boehner, Speaker of the House, wants to file a lawsuit against the president for using executive action because he says he's overstepping his constitutional bounds. Is that the correct interpretation of what's happening with this lawsuit?
That sounds about right to me. We've seen this lawsuit that would sue the president for changing the schedule of implementation of certain pieces of the Affordable Care Act. Now let's remember that Speaker Boehner and Fred Upton, they voted over 40 times to defund the Affordable Care Act. Let's remember that our Congressman Fred Upton said last summer that, gosh, it would not really be a good idea to shut down the federal government over the Affordable Care Act. And he voted 2 months later to do that. Just another example of this, pretty extreme ideological current that he's kind of been swept along by. And now they want to sue the president over a change in the scheduling of implementation of an act that they voted 40 times to defund. Now, the U.S. Congress has never in its history sued the president. So you might want to think, well, is this like a weighty issue of great national importance where there's a serious crime being committed, a serious damage being carried out to a substantial number of people where Congress has to, for the first time, sue the president? No. He wants to change the schedule of implementation for something that just makes sense. This is probably not what I think the majority of people in this district want their representatives to be doing.
It sounds kind of crazy. And of course, there is a constitutional remedy for presidents that commit high crimes and misdemeanors. It's called impeachment.
Indeed.
And there's even some crazy talk about impeachment that's been coming out from some members of the Republican Party, which again, it just sort of doubles down on the crazy, it seems to me, that's been going on in the last 6 years in this country, where the Republicans seem to be completely dedicated to thwarting, blocking, opposing, preventing, setting up obstacles to almost anything that the Obama administration attempts to do.
Sure. And, I will admit that there's blame to be had on both sides in some cases, that if we look at the political parties, that both the Democrats and Republicans have tended to become a little more extreme in their own ideologies in the last few years, partly because our political system, with the way redistricting, I'm a political scientist, the way redistricting takes place encourages that. It encourages it to go to some extent towards the extremes. But the effect of that, when the Republicans in the House of Representatives, they decided when President Obama was elected that, they were not going to work with him.
Right.
And we've pretty much seen that continuing for 6 years. Once they got the majority of the House of Representatives, we've seen very little cooperation between the House and the President. And, we have big issues for the country to face. If the House of Representatives is not going to work with the President, not much is going to get done. The President has been trying to take some executive action. Of course, it'd be better if he worked with Congress. But if Congress is not going to work with him, how can he do that?
Right. And so the main problems that the country faces just get unattended. And so therefore people lose all confidence in government, whereas government is essential if we're going to improve the quality of life for our people.
Government's got to be part of the answer. It's got to be part of the answer. And we need to have Republicans and Democrats and independents working together in a practical way and see how do we solve these problems. And unfortunately, we just don't see nearly enough of that today.
Let's go back to the issue of climate change for a moment, and again, the role of Congressman Upton here. The Environmental Protection Agency under the Bush administration was basically not taking any action to deal with climate change. They were arguing that they didn't have any legal mandate to do so. The state of Massachusetts and some other states ended up suing the Environmental Protection Agency. The case went to the Supreme Court in 2007, and the United States Supreme Court basically told the Environmental Protection Agency that yes, you do have the legal authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, right?
Right.
Very decisive decision that yes, the EPA can do this. And so immediately, Congressman Upton and other Republicans tried to pass legislation to strip the EPA of that legal authority to regulate greenhouse gases. So that's one thing I want you to talk about. But the other thing is that the EPA in early June has finally issued some new regulation on carbon emissions that would come from power plants. And so I want you to talk a little bit about the new EPA regulations and what you think about them, and just the whole issue that the Republicans have tried to block the EPA from having the legal authority to do this.
Sure. Well, let's go back to the first one, and that is Congressman Upton. He passed a bill through the House of Representatives to remove the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases after he became chair of House Energy and Commerce Committee. And I've mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating that prior to that promotion, before he had that chairmanship, he said, as you know, on his website, that we should be regulating greenhouse gases. We should be reducing these emissions.
Everything should be on the table.
Everything should be on the table.
Everything should be on the table.
This is correct. And then once he got that chairmanship, and this is part of how, he's been becoming so much more political in the kind of the derogatory sense. That it seems as though part of the price of that chairmanship was to adopt his own party, the Republican position, which has been that, maybe climate change isn't really caused by people. The federal government ought not to be involved in this. And that was, we saw that with the climate change issue. We saw that with voting to shut down the government, which we've already discussed. Fred Upton said we shouldn't do that, and then his party wanted to do it, so he went along. So he's just been going along with his party in these really extreme political positions that are I think, frankly, hurting all of us. So that happened way back then with the question of regulating greenhouse gases. The Supreme Court, as you said, said that's an appropriate thing for the EPA to do, and he tried to block that. It didn't get through the Senate, so it didn't go anywhere, but that's what he's been trying to do. Now, as we've been discussing, the issue of climate change has only been getting worse as we have not had effective legislation nationally or internationally to contain it. If we're going to have effective action on climate change, we've got to have American leadership. The American leadership has got to be there. In the absence of Congress, of congressional support, the president has been saying, well, what can I do? And he said, well, what he can do legally through his administrative authority is to change the regulations for coal-burning power plants. Now, coal is the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. So the coal-burning power plants, generally speaking, are the ones that emit the most carbon pollution, but also other kinds of pollution that cause respiratory diseases and such. And so the president has put forth some new regulations. Of course, Congressman Upton's against it. That set targets that the states need to reach in terms of reducing their power plant carbon emissions, but give considerable flexibility. Yeah. So the states can figure out what ways it makes sense for them to do it to reach those targets. And both in terms of where we need to be going, where the United States needs to be going, to be consistent with what will be imposed by the international agreement when we get there. It's the kind of thing where if you don't spend $1 today, you're probably going to have to spend $3 down the road. Let's get started now. It'll be cheaper and easier now to address this problem, and that's what the president is pushing us to do.
And as you said, the plan does provide considerable flexibility to the states.
Correct.
Each state's different in terms of carbon emissions, and so one size isn't going to fit all here. So the plan grants that flexibility to each state to come up with their own plan to do this. Another issue with regard to dealing with climate change that's in the Congress right now is a bill that's been introduced by Maryland Congressman Chris Van Hollen. It's called the Healthy Climate and Family Security Act. I don't think you had a chance to read all of it, but I think you're aware of the general outlines of it.
Sure.
It basically puts a total cap on all carbon emissions. The eventual goal is 80% of 2005 levels by 2050. Fossil fuel companies would be required to buy permits for every ton of carbon dioxide that they emit. And 100% of that money that will be generated by that is going right back to the American people. There will be quarterly dividends. So, in other words, this sounds like something Republicans would approve of, money that would be going to the federal government as instead being redirected directly to the American people.
No, Alaska did that, right? With the oil.
Yeah. So, now again, part of the issue here is that we've got to reduce carbon emissions. This is item number one to deal with climate change. This is a plan that sounds like it might be very effective in doing that without causing great kind of disruptions, but it's basically using, in a sense, market mechanisms to try to help reduce emissions. So,
Sure.
Did I describe it properly, or can you fill us in on what you think this kind of a proposal might do?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. And certainly in my own publications, I've indicated that using the market as one tool to help get carbon emissions down to where they need to be, carbon pollution, is probably the right direction to take. So using the market, which historically the Republican Party has been pro-market.
Right.
This is a market-based solution to the problem. And we've already discussed that in terms of overall U.S. economic growth, this is not going to harm us. So our economic growth rate will not be significantly affected by moving towards clean energy, even though our health and our environment will be dramatically improved through these mechanisms. Well, the bill that you described is a bill that gives the money immediately back to the American people, and it gives the money back in a way such that the majority, 80%, I believe, of the American citizens are going to end off with more money in their pocket after this bill is introduced, and particularly for the most part, lower-income people. That it'll be those people who consume a lot more oil, who consume a lot more energy generated by greenhouse gas emitting fuels. They're the ones who are going to pay a little more. So since 80% of us are going to be on the receiving end, and most of those people will be at the lower end of the income spectrum, it's economically efficient. It also addresses poverty. It moves us where we need to be in terms of the environment, in terms of health. I think it's a good plan.
Can I ask you about a foreign policy thing?
Sure.
This week, President Obama is hosting a summit with the leaders from African countries.
Yeah.
Some friends of mine on Monday organized a counter summit, and their critique was that the leaders of the African countries, there's so much corruption, there's so much poor leadership, there's so much pain by the ordinary people, that there needed to be a summit which focused more on the quality of life of the African people. And I know you've done a lot of stuff, international development, and you were in Africa, right, as a Peace Corps worker?
I sure was.
So what do you think should the United States be doing different with the African situation? Because I think it's really important, because China and India are both moving into Africa full speed ahead. And so the United States is kind of on the sidelines for this.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty exciting that just in the last decade that Africa has begun to overcome many of the challenges, of the governance challenges that they faced coming out of colonialism. That in the last few years, many of the fastest growing economies in the world have been in Africa. It has been considered to be the laggard, sort of basket case continent over the last 4 or 5 decades, but now it's coming back, and that's a very exciting and positive development. Now, that being said, what you say that corruption is still very widespread in African governments is certainly true. Now, I want to say that even though there is an element of corruption that needs to be addressed, nevertheless, it is going to be the African governments taking the lead that is the only way to accelerate this trend. That if we don't have African governments working with their own economies, with their own people, to build those economies, to build those where they are democracies, it's not going to be effective. So I think that for the president to invite the heads of state of African countries is a very good thing. That being said, in order for the governments to be held accountable to their own people, we also need stronger, what we call civil society, stronger organizations of the people. So I'm going to say that I'm delighted with both these conferences, the conference and the counter-conference, because we need stronger government and we need the stronger nonprofits, stronger independent organizations to hold their governments accountable for doing the job right.
In general, what are sort of the top issues and values that you think should guide American foreign policy in the future? You're going to be in Congress come next year.
Sure.
What are some of the broader kind of principles and policies do you think that the U.S. should be adopting as it deals internationally with climate change, with development in Africa, with a whole range of issues?
One thing that where I think if we look back a little bit, that we've been prepared to get ourselves involved in wars when the evidence hasn't always been there that this really makes sense. That part of the reason we have such a big foreign debt today is we fought 2 wars on a credit card, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And in Iraq in particular, the evidence in favor of that was, what was presented as the evidence for it, some of it turned out simply to be wrong, to be false. So I do think that we should be more cautious in getting involved in any kind of military entanglement just because the record has not been so positive. I mean, we've been involved in Afghanistan for all these years. Well, how much better off are they today? Once we're gone, how long is it going to take for them to, I fear, have very serious challenges moving forward? The best thing we can do for the international community is rebuild American democracy for ourselves as an example to the rest of the world. That's the first thing we need to do. We've seen an increase in inequality in the United States. We've seen many challenges to our middle class, to our poor, to our democracy. The first thing we need to do is to rebuild our own country. That being said, we are part of an international community. And I think that for many things that we need our government to be more proactive in working with foreign leaders to address and solve common problems. And part of what is exciting and interesting about this is that we have been putting so much money into these military adventures that I don't think have been making us a lot safer, that we could actually cut the expenditure and shift some of it over more to cooperation on common issues like climate change, like AIDS and Ebola, health problems that can affect us also, to working together with other governments on common shared concerns. And I think that will both improve our security, it will improve our standing in the world, and it will be economically beneficial.
Well, I think that's a great answer. And you talk about the importance of improving democracy in the United States.
Yes.
What about the idea of money in politics? You've worked hard because in order to have any kind of a chance to win, you've had to raise a substantial amount of money, but you're going to be outspent at least 5 to 1. what do you think should be done about the money in politics, which ends up being the destructive of the democracy in this country?
Yeah, well, just to lay it on the table, Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that allows corporations to spend essentially unlimited amounts without even saying who's spending it to affect political races, I do think that was a mistake. And I think that if we can find a way to either repeal it or work around it through the Congress, that is certainly something that I would support. But that's just one example of the broader trend. And certainly money in politics, it threatens and to some extent already undermines our democracy in very serious ways. We've talked about it in terms of climate change. I'll say frankly that probably the positive results that the banks have received after the 2008 collapse compared to students, well gosh, maybe the banks are spending more for lobbyists than students are. Who could imagine that? But money in politics is a very serious thing. And I'm grateful to the many contributors to my campaign who've made it possible for me to run. And, I really care about this country. I care about the issues that we're talking about. And I can't get my message out for my values and what I stand for in my campaign without a significant amount of financial support. So I'm grateful for the people who've helped me to do that. I would like to see us moving towards a situation where you don't have to raise, $1 million to run an effective political campaign. And I think that some element of public funding, maybe public matching funds for small-scale contributions, something in that direction, might be a direction to consider in moving in addressing this issue.
And maybe free use of television time. I mean, there's models in other countries where there has been public involvement in campaigns which have made it much more democratic in the long run.
Good political debate is good for all of us.
Yes.
It's good for our democracy, and it's a very appropriate role for the government to support and sustain that.
Good.
The Supreme Court says corporations are persons who have free speech rights and can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence the political debate, and that's I think that's a very troubling conception.
Yeah. And if that were true, I just finished reading Neil Barofsky's book, who was the guy that was overseeing the expenditures after the recent economic collapse, and the crimes that these corporations have committed in getting us there, and then even afterwards, nobody went to jail for any of that. So if they're persons, some of them should be in jail.
You just put out your first television ad. It's a very good and effective ad, I think. Do you anticipate that the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, or Club for Growth, or some of those right-wing organizations that continually fund very savage, negative ads will come into the campaign on Fred's side? Fred's got his own money to spend, but...
yeah, he's got his own money. I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea how they're going to choose to spend their money.
Yeah, but I do think people should know that when they see an ad from Americans for Prosperity, that's the Koch brothers, and it's almost always a negative, distorting ad. They play very loose with the facts. Club for Growth is the same way.
Yeah.
And that I would hope that television viewers have wised up a bit to know that these savage negative ads are coming from groups who have a vested interest in skewing the political process one way or another, and should be very cautious about how they interpret such ads.
We saw last year, a non-election year, we saw an American Chemical Association or Society, forget the name, and also a Petroleum Institute spending over $300,000 on ads saying Fred Upton's a nice guy.
Yeah.
On ads in favor of Congressman Upton at a time when it was still over a year before an election. I have no idea what that was about.
Yeah. But it is troubling that kind of outside heavy money can come in and try to tip the balance in a local race. And
Congressman Upton is one of 66 members of the House and Senate that in the last election got over half of their contributions from outside their home state. Not just from outside the district, from outside Michigan, from outside their home state. And I wonder if that might affect his representation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question. I wonder. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, and first of all, Paul, I want to thank you for being our guest today and talking about so many different issues. We threw a lot at you. I do want to go back to the UN Climate Summit once again, though, because I think that's so very important. It's coming up on September 23rd, and I wanted people to know that various environmental groups, such as 350.org, Bill McKibben's organization, Paul was instrumental in helping Bill McKibben come to Kalamazoo last year to talk about this important issue. But 350.org and some other environmental groups are sponsoring an important People's Climate March to take place on Sunday, September 21st, leading up to the UN Summit. And I plan to go. I'm on my way to New York. I'm going to go visit my old college roommate, but the main purpose is to attend the People's Climate March on the 21st. And so I'd like to encourage other people out there to consider. They're trying to get the largest rally and march in support of climate change ever in world history to take place in New York. And I was in New York once before with over 1 million people, June 12, 1982, to talk about the nuclear weapons issue. And I don't know if we'll get 1 million people in Central Park this time, but certainly would like to see a large representation there. We have our own local 350.org group. Mark Miller, our good friend Mark Miller, heads up the Kalamazoo 350.org. And so if people are interested in participating in the climate march, they can get a hold of Mark Miller or myself, and we'd be happy to provide more information about what's going to be happening in New York on September 21st. All right, so where are we at in time here, John? Are we just about 1 minute to go? Okay, so again, let me thank Paul. And Paul, if people would like to get in touch with you or your campaign to help out in any way, what should they do?
Sure. Please take a look at my website, clementsforcongress.com. CLEMENTSFOR, Congress.com. And there's a contact button there, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Sounds good. Don, thanks.
Good.
Well, it's
Thank
good
you,
to
Ron.
chat with you. And Paul, again, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks,
And
Ron.
we invite you to join us again on another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views.